And one. Hey there, Reverend Brandan. Thank you for being here.
It's so good to be here.
Absolutely. So you are a certified Reverend pastor, right?
Yes, it's sad that immediately as you said certified, my mind went to certified freak 7 days a week. But yes, I am a pastor.
Okay, sweet. And do you have what type of church is it for? Is it a non-denominational or?
Yeah, I mean, we feel like a non-denominational church. We're a very progressive Christian church, but we're part of a denomination that's called the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which sounds either like a cult or very pretentious. So we don't often use that name, but it's a super cool progressive denomination. So
Sweet, that's really cool. And what is your history with the church? Did you grow up in the church? Is that something you found later in life?
yeah, so I grew up non-religious in Maryland, and then I started going to church with my neighbors when I was 12, and it was there that I kind of had a major conversion experience. And really, from 12 years old to 28 today, I've been pursuing pastoral ministry, being a pastor, studying theology, and just kind of been all in on this Jesus thing. So
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's awesome. That's really, really good for you. What about because you also identify as gay, right?
yeah.
Okay. So found Jesus at 12. When did you find out about your sexuality?
Yeah, I feel like that's always a hard question to answer. Obviously, looking back, I think I can see my gayness popping up throughout my childhood. But it was really probably when I was 16, I had this very visceral experience where I remember walking into my fundamentalist church and looking at this guy who'd been around for a long time. But this time, I realized I had an attraction for him. And that moment of realization was immediately met with fear and anxiety because I knew that my church taught that being gay was a sin. And not only that, but that I could never be a pastor if I felt this way.
Sure.
And so that led me into probably 10 years of trying to suppress that and hide that and be straight. And then in 2015, I eventually was outed and started living my best gay life. And it's been good.
Yeah. Wow. So you were outed. So it wasn't your decision.
I was slowly starting to come out, but it was actually a super dramatic process of being outed because I had a book deal. I'd written a book with a conservative publisher, and they dropped it because I was supporting marriage equality publicly. And so in Time magazine, one of the reporters reached out and said they wanted to do a story on that, but that they also had talked to folks and knew that I was gay, and so they wanted to include that in the story. And I was supposed to have a couple weeks to come out to people, but after that conversation, the next day the story went live, and so that's how my parents found out, my friends, everybody just was pushed
Outed
out
by
to me.
Time magazine, though. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, it was traumatic for exactly one day, and then I was living in DC at the time, and my dating life early on was so great because I was just out there, people knew, and it was wonderful. So
Yeah.
yeah.
How did your parents take it when they found out?
So they did pretty well. They're not, again, super religious, probably nominally only Christian, and they're okay with me describing them this way, but I would describe them as kind of rednecky conservatives. We grew up in a trailer park in a small town in Maryland. And so they really have a live and let live mentality, or they did at that time. And it was like, fine, like we've kind of always known and we'll support you. So I was grateful for that.
Was that surprising to you?
No, I mean, again, by this point, I mean, I was the stereotypical gay kid. And so they had to have known I was the one who I was in choir for 18 years. I spoke in a soprano toned voice. So I think they knew, I think they were prepared for it. I think that they were actually happier with who I became on the other side of coming out, because up till that point, I was a young little fundamentalist kid who was coming home and trying to convert my parents and telling them they were going to hell. And after that, obviously, I became much more progressive and open-minded, and I think they like me better on this side. So,
good.
yeah.
Funny how that works.
Yeah.
How did the church take it then? Because you were practicing as a preacher, and so what happened then?
Yeah. So at that point, when I was out, I had just graduated Bible college from a conservative school in Chicago, and during those 4 years, I had conversion therapy, and I did all of that stuff. And people kind of saw in my religious world that I was moving towards the left, as they would have put it, and moving towards coming out. And so when Time Magazine did the story, very publicly, like the Southern Baptist Convention leaders did podcasts about me, calling me a heretic. And there's this terrible magazine called The Christian Post, and they wrote some stories about me. And just like I felt what I expected, which was widespread condemnation from people that I admired and had learned from.
Mhm.
But it was also in that period in DC that I started working for an organization called Faith in Public Life. And it was a progressive organization that worked with progressive faith communities. And I discovered all of these liberal, accepting pastors and churches and communities. And so while I was being pushed out by one kind of Christianity, I was being welcomed in and discovering a new kind of Christianity. And I think that saved me, and it saved my faith. I don't think I would have probably maintained my faith if I just had the conservative experience.
Yeah, it shows the importance of accepting Christians, of Christians being accepting,
Totally.
because it saves your faith, and obviously, like, a Christian's goal is to want their neighbors to be practicing their faith. Like, that's the message in the Bible, right? To, like, spread the word to the end of the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
For the sake of this podcast, I guess I should say that I'm not religious, just to add context, and I don't have it identify with a certain faith. So,
well, my role in this podcast is to convert you, so it's going to be great.
You show up at the door with like the Bible in hand.
Yeah, like a good Mormon missionary.
Right. So why do you think that, like, homophobia is like such a huge problem within the church, within the Christian community, and many religions, but this is specifically on Christians? So where do you think that stems from? Why is it so prevalent in the Christian community, who Jesus is all about spreading love and loving your neighbor? So where does that message kind of get diluted and messed up?
Yeah. I'll give you the super nerdy answer, because this is what I've been spending a lot of time doing over the past couple of years, is really looking into my whole master's degree in theology was on first century Greco-Roman sexuality. So I was looking at the world that Jesus lived in, trying to figure out where the few verses in the Bible that seem to condemn homosexuality, where they came from and what they were talking about, and how it's impacted how Christians believe today. And the truth is, Judaism and Christianity spent a lot of time, most of our scriptures were about being different than the cultures around them. Mm-hmm. And so the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible is all full of these rules for Jewish people that weren't moral rules. They were rules, they literally say, like, do this so that you're not like the Egyptians. And then when we get to the New Testament in Jesus's world, there were all sorts of sexual situations happening all throughout the Roman Empire. It was very common for people to have sex with people of the same gender who were lower class in kind of like an exploitative way. If I was a wealthy man, I could essentially rape slaves. That was super common. And so when you come to the Bible and you see the things that it says about men having sex with men, that's the kind of context it's talking about. And so it says, don't be like the Greco-Roman people who are having orgies every day and who are raping slaves. And if you understand that context, I'm pretty on board with saying, hey, we probably shouldn't be doing that. And that's probably worthy of being different from. But right. I think what's happened is that people don't actually do the research. Even pastors and scholars and theologians don't actually dig into these questions because it doesn't affect them. Mm-hmm. And so they just take things at the face value. And if you take the Bible at face value, a 4,000-year-old book, you're obviously going to miss some things because the culture, the context, the language was so different. And I just think Christians have taken a bad reading of the Bible with no context and used that for 2,000 years to oppress LGBT people, but also women, also people of color. I mean,
yeah,
you name it. So,
yeah, it really, like, it kind of turns the whole message around of the Bible, because when as a non-religious person, like, I read the Bible and I can, like, I see it and I'm like, and I think, like, I don't know what, like, but Jesus would, I feel like, would be very left-leaning. is what my point is. And,
Yeah. I think one could say that. I think if you look at what we know are the actual teachings of Jesus from the four Gospels, you're right. I mean, he's the one saying things like, blessed are the peacemakers, love your enemy. He's the one who appointed women to be his disciples, which was unheard of for a rabbi in the first century. So he was definitely socially progressive, and it's unfortunate that conservatives have kind of laid claim to him and won the marketing war because everybody thinks Jesus was a right-wing conservative, which is
right.
not fun. So
wearing a MAGA hat, holding a gun.
Yeah, exactly.
What about what about the Bible actually inserting the word homosexuality? Because didn't that not happen until like the late 1800s or somewhere in there? It was like really later on where the word homosexuality wasn't even like invented.
Until 1946 is when it appears in the Bible. So that's the thing that other people also can't wrap their minds around, and it's frustrating. I talk about this on TikTok all the time, and people just don't seem to get it. But homosexuality as a concept and heterosexuality didn't exist until the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's a psychological concept. The idea of sexuality, it wasn't a thing like for all of human history. And so the word homosexuality doesn't show up until the Bible, until after that concept has been developed. And there's a new documentary coming out called 1946 that shows that it was actually very intentionally put into the Bible once that concept was known, because early on in Western history in the 1900s, we know that everyone was pretty homophobic. It was when people were finding out that gays were real things, and then there was tons of false media about how deviant we were, blah, blah, blah. And so people were afraid. And what these translators did was take these verses from the Bible, which are actually, again, talking about sexual exploitation, which is an important message, and one that, for instance, there's so much sexual abuse in the church today. Imagine what would have happened if those verses weren't changed to homosexuality, but were seen as condemning sexual abuse. But instead, they put in the word homosexuality and thus changed what most people think the Bible says for the next however many years it's been.
Yeah. Wow. Why do you think they did that? Why do you think did they just want to discriminate against gay people?
Yeah, I do think so. The documentary will go into it much more than I know, but sure. My hunch would be that everyone was discriminated against gay people. I think at that time, not to justify it, but I think it was just like the common thing that people were afraid of LGBT people because of the false narratives that were being promoted, primarily by religious people and conservative folks. And so I don't know if it was quite as devious as like, let's stick it to them, but I do think it was just rooted in ignorance. And I think whenever fear is present in any decision-making process, it's always going to result in harm. And I think that's what happened there.
Yeah, probably. How does one respond to discrimination with love in a way that, you know, Jesus would want for someone to do? How does someone who is gay and trying to practice a religion and they get discriminated against by people in their church, people in their family, how should they respond?
Yeah, there's no easy answer here. I talk about it though, using Jesus as an example. There's like the path of advocacy and then there's the path of activism. I think for so many LGBT people who come from conservative backgrounds or who may have been rejected by their families, it's not your job to have to respond with love. You've been hurt. And a lot of times our safety and well-being is on the line. And so I think it's a really cruel thing for especially religious leaders to turn around and say, but you've got to love that. Like, okay, well, wait until you get some stability and a support network and some healing, and then maybe you can go back and try to reconcile. But so the two paths, I would say, for those of us who have done the work and kind of healed of our trauma, like I feel called back into conservative spaces. So I often talk to conservative people because it doesn't hurt me anymore. And I can engage and help to change their minds, hopefully. For everyone else, I would say be an activist, which means Jesus turned over tables sometimes. Jesus spoke truth to power, put homophobic churches on blast. there is a role for that, and that does create change. And I think you need both the people who are talking to the conservative religious folks and the people who are exposing the danger of the conservative religious folks to actually create some meaningful change in the world. So that's what I'd say.
Sure. Yeah, that's really good. Have you seen in your experience with, which is being very involved with the church and Christianity in America, are you seeing a shift over the years of a lot more people being accepting, a lot more churches?
Yeah, it's never as fast as we would want it to be, but over the past 5 years, I've gotten the chance to travel the world speaking about LGBT inclusion, and every country I go to, it's remarkable to see the churches that are changing, the denominations that are changing, and these powerful queer-led movements that are saying, I'm queer, I'm Christian, I'm queer, I'm Muslim, and I'm not going to allow that to be a contradiction despite what the religious leaders are saying. So I think we'll see a lot of change continuing over the next 50 years. And I don't think we'll see like the Catholic Church anytime soon coming out and saying it's okay to be gay. But that's the tension that I think you have to walk with religion. We're always about 15 steps behind cultural progress. So,
well, what's the difference? Well, didn't the Pope say something? Didn't he?
Yeah. So the Pope just said last week that he supports civil unions, which for LGBT people, we kind of roll our eyes at that and we're like,
right.
Yeah, okay, that's a half step. For Catholics, it's a huge deal, and it caused a lot of problems in the church because the truth is, I mean, Pope Francis is a progressive, and he's in an institution run by powerful, shall I say, closeted conservative priests, and they are really anti-Francis. And so Francis saying that didn't change Catholic doctrine or teaching, but it has ignited a conversation. Some of my mentors are Catholic priests, and it's just been interesting to see how they've rejoiced because they're more progressive too, but also said, like, this isn't actually going to change all that much. So
yeah, okay. Yeah, the civil union endorsing that is like, come on, dude, just like that's not what we want. We want marriage, but fine, at least you're not telling us to go to hell.
Yeah. His predecessor definitely did, so this is a refreshing step.
Yeah. How do you feel about sex before marriage? I mean, in general, I mean, I know what the Bible says. I know what a lot of Christian people think, but relating to your queer experience and having sex before marriage, what are your thoughts?
I think sex feels great, but but. So I think this is another thing that, again, people just have accepted church teaching and not actually looked at the Bible. The Bible doesn't have a single verse that condemns premarital sex. It's not in there from Genesis to Revelation. There are words like fornication and adultery, and they're very ambiguous words in English. And the word that's often translated fornication, which would be sex before marriage, is the word porneia. In Greek, which is where we get pornography from. And it literally is just a word that meant sexual. It just referred to a whole.
Hold on, I didn't get it cut out for like 10 seconds. I'm sorry.
No. Okay. So the word porneia was just this word that referred to all sorts of sexual deviant behavior. It had no direct correlation to premarital sex. Like, that wasn't even a concept in many of the ancient cultures of the world. So I think I encourage people, I think it's healthy for young people not to live in a culture or in a religious environment that tells them that these desires and feelings that they naturally have during their adolescence are somehow flawed and wrong and needed to be repressed. And as somebody who grew up in that culture and did repress my sexuality until I was 22, 23, it does more damage than good. It stunted my emotional, spiritual progress, I think, as a person. So I tell people to do whatever their conscience tells them to do. The Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 14, he says, what sin for one person may not be sin for another person, so don't judge anyone. And I think if you want to wait until marriage, great, do that. But I think for the vast majority of people, we're going to have sex, and sex is healthy and good and a God-given expression, and meant for our pleasure and our connection. And so, yeah, do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Don't have to say that twice.
Yeah.
What is it for like young gay people growing up? What should they look for in a space that will allow them to flourish in both their as a gay Christian and as a young queer person? What should they be looking for, and where do you think that they can find places to fit in and to grow in a healthy way?
Yeah. I mean, if we're talking about spiritual communities, people are just so unaware of how many progressive religious communities there are. Again, this is something I see on TikTok all the time, people saying, where can I find a church like yours? And it's like, there is likely a progressive church within 10 miles of pretty much anyone in the United States. And so I think connecting to communities like that encourage you, that will allow you to explore and change your beliefs and perspectives. And I always recommend this one website, gaychurch.org, which sounds super gay, but it's actually just a good website of essentially every church in the country that's LGBT inclusive. And if they're LGBT inclusive, they're also likely sex positive and embrace science and evolution and stuff like that. So I'm still a big fan as a pastor of churches, and I think that they can be really healthy and helpful communities. And I just encourage folks to find them. And in this season, to join in them digitally. We've been having tons of folks from out of state and around the world join our church on Sunday mornings on Zoom. And it's just been super fun to get to interact with folks and kind of form this global community of queer Christians. So that's super fun.
Yeah. Okay. Great. That's awesome. Do you? I know on TikTok, when you get these messages from people who are telling you that that being gay is a sin, that you're going to hell, how do you react and respond internally? And like, how do you? What can other people do who will get similar messages or whose friends tell them that too?
Yeah. Again, I think my response is going to be different from most people's because I have both the privilege and the curse of being around this 24/7. It's my job. And so it doesn't bother me at all. When my faith shifted 5 or 6 years ago in a major way, I got the onslaught of hate. And then once I stopped believing in hell, honestly, I was like, okay, well, I don't care about what you like. What are you threatening me with? But for other people, I think there's something to be said, especially for young LGBT people who are getting these messages on TikTok or other platforms. The block and delete is really important because it does take a toll on most people's mental health. And you also have to understand that most of these people, frankly, are ignorant. They don't know what they're talking about. They've heard a preacher say something one time and they're just parroting it, but it's not rooted in truth. It's not rooted in good scholarship. It's not rooted in good religion. And so really, I would just encourage people not to even allow it have space in your emotional mind. Block, delete, and move on, and don't take it seriously, and know that there are plenty of people and resources out there that can show you why exactly what they're saying is wrong. So
Right. Yeah. You said you don't believe in hell. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, totally.
A pretty progressive statement. I could hear Christians listening right now going, "What?"
Yeah. Again, this is something that, like, I know it sounds radical, but it's really only conservative evangelicals that hold on to hell very strongly. Almost every other kind of Christian is ambiguous on hell or is universalist. And universalism, meaning the belief that everyone is saved in the end, has been a teaching of Christianity since the time of Jesus. And there's books and books and books over the years that have been written on that. But the idea is Jewish people didn't have a concept of heaven or hell. In the first century, all from the beginning of Judaism to the first century, that didn't exist. You can't find it anywhere. It's not in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. There are words like the word Sheol, which have been translated in English as hell. But if you ask any Jewish rabbi, they'll tell you Sheol is the Jewish concept of an in-between state. You die, you go to Sheol, and then Jews believed in a resurrection, that everybody at some point would actually come physically back to life, which is why if you go to Israel today, outside of Jerusalem, you'll see the Jewish burial grounds surrounding it, and all the tombs are above ground because they were expecting people to need to get out of their tombs and resurrect.
Yeah.
So heaven and hell were Zoroastrian concepts that melded into Christianity in like the 3rd century, 300 years after Jesus, and then became prevalent in the church because it was prevalent in society. And so when you find verses of Jesus talking about hell, again, he's using words like Gehenna, which was a reference to a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem where they would light garbage on fire. And Jesus was making a metaphorical statement. He's saying, if you continue to walk in greedy, self-serving paths, you're going to take yourself and our culture and our society into the garbage dump. He's not talking about God sending us to eternal health forever. He's saying your actions now will result in a hell-like state for us. And I think that is a much more helpful understanding of Jesus and of heaven and hell, that we can make them realities now. And that's what Christians should be about, saving people from hell on earth, not in the afterlife.
Yeah, and look, I feel like we're headed towards hell on earth, which is climate change and the greed of corporations and powerful people. Like,
yeah,
Jesus was right. Well, shit, maybe I'm gonna become a Christian now.
That's literally it. And it's almost, I mean, I wouldn't go here, but you could. I mean, the Bible does talk about judgment of the earth burning up in flames, and it's kind of this image of like, maybe these prophets actually knew something about how we were going to denigrate the planet to the point of our own destruction. So something to think about.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
What do you think Jesus died for then? Like, how do you explain that if most Christians believe that he came to forgive us for our sins and like his death was the way to save us from hell?
Yeah. Again, I think I have the overwhelming support of the Bible on my side. Just read the account of Jesus's death, and it's clear why he died. He was taken before the Roman governor of Israel and accused of being a political dissident. That's literally in all 4 Gospels. It's in the Bible. It says Jesus is taken before them and accused of religious crimes, of heresy, and political crimes because he kept saying he's establishing a new kingdom, and there was only one kingdom, that was the kingdom of Rome. And in that day, in the 1st century Palestine, it was common for people to rise up and say, let's overthrow the empire. And the way the empire dealt with that, they crucified people. That was super common. The cross is not a unique thing to Jesus. Thousands of people were crucified all over the Roman world. And so I think Jesus died as somebody who was trying to reveal to humanity the better way to organize our societies and our lives and our world. And that message of love your neighbor, love your enemy, do good to others, that's offensive to our, what I would say, sinful human impulses towards greed and the things we see in our culture. And I think Jesus's death is so profound and beautiful because he willingly walks towards his execution, knowing that if he kept saying what he was saying and doing what he was doing, he was going to die. And even while he was dying, he looks down at the people killing him and he says, God forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. It's this powerful image saying, in Christian theology, God becomes a human to show us what the right way is, and our response is to kill him. Wow. And I think that, I mean, that'll preach. That's a message. And then the resurrection, whether or not you believe it's literal or metaphorical, the idea is that our greed won't have the last word in the end, that there is a God who is going to rise above our evil and our sinfulness and redeem everyone and everything. And I think that's the hope of Christianity that we look towards, that even if we do screw all this up, there's a belief that somehow, some way, God's going to intervene and set everything right.
Yeah. Wow, that is powerful. That imagery of him dying and saying, forgive them, they don't know what they've done. What do you think happens to bad people then? Like Hitler, where is he?
Yeah. So this is the offensive part of Christianity, but it's offensive in a different way than conservatives say. Conservatives say Christianity is offensive because we get to draw a line and say most people are going to hell. I think Christianity is offensive because the whole crux of the message of Jesus is grace. It's that there is no one, absolutely no one, that is deserving of forgiveness but that absolutely everyone will receive forgiveness. And that means the early Christians, St. Gregory of Nyssa wrote, "The last one to be saved will be Satan himself." The idea that God, who is fundamentally love, will redeem even the embodiment of evil itself. Because the truth is, and this is a profound truth of Christianity, all of us have the capability to do the kind of evil that Hitler did. Most of us won't, but all of us know that that's within us to do. And if God's powerful love that created everything that is can't break the human heart and cause it to desire to change its ways and to surrender to love, then I think we're all pretty hopeless. Because, I mean, Christians always used to say, "But for the grace of God, there go I." Like, all of us can mess up. All of us are going to need God's love. And so the offensive message of Christianity is that even the worst humans in history will one day, we would say it theologically, bow their knee to Jesus, submit to the way of Jesus, which is loving, caring, giving to others. And I hope that's true for Hitler. I mean, goodness, wouldn't that be a story of redemption if some reality in the future, we find these evil people that are trying to undo some of the evil that they've done? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What? So do you believe in sins? Like, do you believe that there are sins that?
Yeah, I think sin's a weird word. I think it's a misused word. So, yeah, I think we all sin. A sin is simply, the word is in Greek hamartia, which literally just means missing the mark. Anything we do that leads us away from our own health and wholeness, leads others away from health and wholeness, or destroys creation, I think is sin. And again, I think there are some very clear universal sins. I actually think the 10 Commandments, 5 of the 10 Commandments are moral laws, and I think they're pretty good moral laws. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, which is stealing your neighbor's spouse. I think those are pretty good. But then when we get to conversations around sex or these very complex issues, the Bible talks about the law of God being written on human hearts, which to me is just talking about our conscience, that we have this thing that I believe God has put within us, and we know when we're doing something that is helping us progress as humans or taking us backwards and making us more animalistic and pulling us back evolutionarily. And so I think that's what sin is. And I think if you follow the path of Jesus, which is simply the path of considering others before yourself, I think that's what the whole gospel is about. I think we're going to be pulled away from being selfish and self-interested, and we're going to be dedicated to helping others live good lives. And I think that's how you avoid sinning. So
yeah, okay. Do you believe in the Book of Revelation, the end time?
So again, like, so it's what's funny to me is that, yeah, the Book of Revelation, just like so many things, there's the dominant narrative that conservatives have won. And so people think of the Book of Revelation as a book about the end of the world and this crazy book of antichrists and blah, blah, blah. Almost all biblical scholars have known for 2,000 years and say in every book you'll read about Revelation, Revelation was a book about things that already happened. They happened in the first century. It's well known that the Antichrist, the beast of Revelation, 666, that was a numeral that was used for Emperor Nero. And so the writer of Revelation, this Christian man, was writing to Christians who were being persecuted by the Roman Empire, but he couldn't use the emperor's name because he'd get killed. And so they were using imagery and symbols to basically say, God's going to destroy the emperor someday. Keep the faith, hold on. Things are going to get bad for you, Christians, but God's going to win in the end. And I think that whether or not it's historically happened that way, it didn't. But you can get, like, if we were living in an oppressive regime, we might be, if Trump wins next week, then, like, yeah, we might need to be communicating in code. And it would be helpful for someone like me, a pastor, to be writing to my congregation and encouraging them to not give up. And that's what Revelation was.
Wow. Yeah, I never heard that before.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the church, but I don't really I grew up in a private school too, but since I've been 18, I haven't gone much. But
What kind of church?
It was non-denominational. It was just, they just called it Christian.
Yeah. So you heard all the rapture theology and
Yes.
Left Behind.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Left Behind. Yep. Watched that with my grandma.
Yeah. It's, I mean, interesting stuff. It's just so sad that people believe it's true. It causes so much trauma for young people,
Yeah.
especially. Like, goodness.
Every time I can't find my mom in the house, and it's like, oh my God, what happened?
Yeah.
I get left behind.
Yes. So terrible. So terrible.
So what's your overall message to the church and the LGBT community? What would, I guess we can break it down separately, but what would you tell these two separate communities? What would you want them to hear?
I think in general, my message to Christians is there is a more educated, reality adjacent, viscerally true, experiential way to embrace our faith that doesn't require us to be assholes, frankly, and doesn't require us to suspend logic and read. Like, these things have been put against each other, and it's just my hope, because I've had the privilege, and it is a position of privilege to be able to sit in rooms for years studying and reading and learning this stuff. And I just really want to help Christians kind of normalize the things that I said in this interview. Like, this isn't crazy liberal stuff. This is mainstream understandings of the Bible, but most Christians don't know it. And if they did, the way they live their lives, the way they interacted in the world, I think would be significantly more helpful to everyone. And then to the LGBT community, I think statistically, over half of us identify as religious or spiritual. But of that half of all LGBT people, I know that most of us are afraid to ever step back into any kind of religious institution, and rightfully so. But I want to empower us to not wait for the church to become accepting, or synagogue or mosque. Do it on our own. Like, we can innovate. We can take this bull by the horns. We don't need to wait to be included. We have spiritual wisdom and insight. I really believe that. I think the coming out process makes us so much more spiritually mature than the average straight person, because of all the stuff we have to deal with ego and identity. I think we are gifts. And I think if we just start creating our own communities, if we just start embracing faith on our terms, we're going to create powerful, powerful stuff that doesn't only benefit us, but will actually make the straights' lives better as well. So
yeah, right. Well, that's really beautiful. That's encouraging too. One person submitted a question in this live stream, and they wanted to know, does God love gay people?
Yes, quite simply, yes. I think God's fundamental nature is love. And I think because we exist, we're obviously made by God. Christians and Jews believe that we're made in the image of God, which would also mean that our sexuality reflects something of God, which might mean that God is gay. So anyways, long story short, yes. Just drop that in real quick.
Yeah, right. And I'm curious your thoughts on this matter. Amy Coney Barrett coming onto the Supreme Court. What do you think that means for queer rights in America?
It's hard to know. I think, again, Lord willing, Joe Biden wins next week. We pack the court, and I think we're okay. Mm-hmm. I think if not, I don't think marriage equality is going to be touched, even though they're going to talk about it and they're going to try to scare us. I don't think they're going to be able to touch that. I do think trans folks are going to feel the brunt of the rollback of policies, and bathroom bills and stuff like that, I believe, will become a thing that probably the court will be dealing with. Mm-hmm. And then obviously we all know, I think the biggest first target of Justice Barrett is going to be women's reproductive rights. And I do think that within the next 4 years, if Trump wins, Roe versus Wade is going to be done. So that's scary. And we're going to need a lot of rallying together to fight back against that.
Yeah. So pro-choice Christian, what's your explanation? How do you sell that to someone?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy thing to sell because, again, conservatives have won the narrative here. I mean, even the language pro-life, I mean, that sounds better than pro-choice. We're all pro-life. Of course we're pro-life. But I think the question is, needs to move out of religion and needs to move into science. That's the only way to deal with this if you're going to try to justify abortion. I think I tell people, I don't know a liberal who wants to see more abortions. We're all trying to lower the amount of abortions. And the way you do that is expanding sex education, expanding contraception, things that conservatives are against. And so that's one side of it. But then the question of when does life actually begin? Again, we're not supporting more abortions or encouraging it, but a fetus at 1, 2, 3 months is not a living human being. And I think the science is fairly clear on that. And yeah, I think this is the hardest thing I ever have to talk about, though, because we on the left are the ones who in their narrative are arguing for murder. And that's a narrative that's really hard to overcome. And so I don't know that there's ever going to be any real progress as long as conservative evangelicals have and conservative Catholics have such a majority in our country.
Yeah, I have a grasp on that. Well, thank you for doing this with me. It was really fun. Do you want to drop your your socials, tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, I think BrandanRobertson.com is for most things. And then these days I spend most of my time on TikTok at Reverend Brandan Robertson. So yeah, but thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed this conversation. I love hearing this kind of stuff. So it's fascinating. I think I might actually send this to my brothers because we're one of them. He's very, very into the church, but in the right-wing way.
Good. Oh, well, not good. But be prepared for him to tell you that I'm a heretic. Hey, brother.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate this, and keep up the great work, and I'll see you later.
Likewise. Yeah, good to see you.
All right. Bye-bye.